In the silence of Ottawa's Defence Command, decisions were being shaped that would define the future of Canada's skies. For years, Canada's Air Force had relied on aging CF-18 Hornets, aircraft that had served bravely but were now ghosts of a past era. Technology had leapt forward, and the world's major powers were flying jets that could see without being seen. The question was simple but deadly in weight. What would guard the skies of the North for the next 40 years? The US lobbied hard, promising that the F-35 Lightning II was the answer. A machine born from stealth and advanced computing, it was advertised as the pinnacle of modern warfare. A flying supercomputer cloaked in radar-absorbing skin. Canada, a longtime ally of the US, seemed destined to follow the same path. Meetings were held, deals discussed, and billions in contracts drafted. The choice looked inevitable. Until a quiet name began echoing through defense circles. Gripen E. From the north of Europe, in the snowy landscapes of Sweden, Saab had built something extraordinary. It wasn't just another fighter jet. It was a statement of independence. The Gripen E was smaller, lighter, and vastly more adaptable. It didn't demand expensive maintenance hangars or armies of technicians. It was made to survive, to take off from highways, refuel in the field, and return to combat in minutes. It was the fighter for nations that wanted power without dependence. Inside Canada's Air Command, whispers began spreading. Some officers, tired of political strings and endless American oversight, started looking closely at the Swedish design. The Gripen E's cost per flight hour was half that of the F-35. Its operational range, sensors, and weapons integration rivaled far more expensive aircraft. And perhaps most crucially, it gave control back to the user. No need for constant American software approvals, no restrictions on upgrades, no hidden codes. Freedom was its true weapon. In closed-door briefings, Gripen's engineers demonstrated the jet's brilliance. Digital combat systems that adapted in real time. Radar so powerful, it could track stealth aircraft. AI-assisted targeting that could decide faster than any human. The Canadian officers watching were impressed and uneasy. Could a smaller, independent jet really outmatch the F-35's global reputation? As days turned into months, tension built between those who believed in tradition and those who believed in change. Political pressure from the US grew quietly but firmly. Behind every Canadian defense discussion, American advisors appeared, offering support, but ensuring the F-35's dominance wasn't questioned. But Saab didn't retreat. The Swedish ambassador met Canadian officials, showing reports, data, and even combat simulations. Gripen E wasn't just competition. It was a symbol of technological rebellion. Meanwhile, out in the snow-covered fields of Sweden, test pilots continued to push the Gripen E to its limits. The jet soared through freezing winds, its afterburners slicing the cold air. Engineers watched its data feeds, refining, improving, and perfecting. Every upgrade was immediate. No political chains, no foreign permissions. Saab's goal was clear. Prove that the world didn't need to rely on America to rule the skies. Inside Canada, the debate reached its peak. Parliament members whispered of cost overruns, secret clauses, and unspoken expectations in the F-35 deal. Some wondered if the choice was truly strategic or simply diplomatic pressure dressed as defense. The Gripen's numbers were impossible to ignore. Cheaper, simpler, more sovereign. But the weight of alliances was heavier than truth itself. The final decision loomed like a shadow over every official in the room. And then came the leaks. Anonymous insiders revealed classified comparisons, documents showing the Gripen E outperforming the F-35 in specific Arctic scenarios. Pilots reportedly preferred its agility and responsiveness. Maintenance crews favored its simplicity. The truth was leaking like oil through the cracks of bureaucracy, and the world began to notice. Defense analysts started asking questions. Was Canada really making the best choice, or the easiest one? In the end, it was no longer a question of which aircraft could fly higher or faster. It was about what kind of nation Canada wanted to be, independent or obedient. In those quiet nights before the final signature, there were still generals who looked at the data, looked at the skies, and wondered if they were witnessing a mistake that history would never forgive. The F-35 stood as the symbol of power. But the Gripen E had become the symbol of freedom. And somewhere, deep in the Arctic silence, the future waited to see which one would truly conquer the cold Canadian skies. The announcement came with fanfare, flashing lights, and diplomatic smiles. Canada had officially chosen the F-35 Lightning II as its next-generation fighter jet. The Prime Minister spoke confidently before the cameras, calling it a historic moment for Canada's defense. The US praised the decision. Allies applauded. Yet behind the carefully crafted speeches and the patriotic music, unease rippled quietly through the ranks of those who knew the full story. Pilots, engineers, and analysts who had worked closely with the evaluation process knew that the Gripen E had performed far better than anyone had expected. During Arctic simulations, the Swedish jet had shown superior reliability in freezing conditions, landing and taking off from icy runways where the F-35 struggled. Its electronic warfare systems detected threats long before radar confirmation. Its agility in dogfights astonished even veteran pilots. The Gripen had not lost. It had been outmaneuvered politically. In secret, a few defense officials began to talk. "We didn't pick the best jet," one murmured under the glow of a classified briefing room. "We picked the most convenient one." The truth was complex. The F-35 brought influence, partnerships, and interoperability with the US Air Force. But it also brought dependency, constant updates, software keys, and rules that tied Canada's hands. Gripen E, on the other hand, represented autonomy. A path where Canada could control its own upgrades, weapons, and strategy. It was the fighter for those who believed in freedom of command. But freedom had a price, and not everyone was willing to pay it. Reports surfaced that American officials had quietly lobbied Canadian leaders, warning them of potential security concerns if they chose a non-NATO standard jet. Billions in industrial benefits were promised as part of the F-35 deal. Jobs, partnerships, joint projects, all carefully placed incentives that made the American offer nearly impossible to reject. The Gripen, despite its brilliance, could not compete with politics. Yet something strange began to happen after the announcement. Independent analysts and military journalists started digging into the evaluation documents. They discovered oddities, tests where Gripen scored higher, but the final reports gave the advantage to F-35. Technical metrics that seemed rewritten, even internal memos hinting at US guidance on certain criteria. Slowly, a shadow began to creep over what had been portrayed as a clean victory. Questions emerged that no one wanted to answer. Why had Gripen been dismissed so quietly, despite its clear advantages? Meanwhile, in Sweden, Saab engineers watched the news with quiet smiles. They had expected this outcome. Politics was an opponent even stealthier than any aircraft. But they also knew something Canada's politicians didn't. Gripen's story was far from over. The E model was evolving fast. Each new version pushed its limits further. Stronger radar, better electronic warfare suites, new engine upgrades, and even unmanned drone integration. The Gripen wasn't just surviving, it was preparing for a comeback. Back in Canada, a few retired officers began to speak publicly. They called the Gripen the jet that could have changed everything. Interviews surfaced, debates sparked online, and comparisons flooded defense forums. The question became louder. Had Canada traded sovereignty for alliance? As the F-35 rollout began, so did the whispers of restrictions, hidden maintenance costs, and software locks that required US approval. One night under the pale Arctic moon, a Canadian test pilot flew a training mission in an F-35. He watched its sensors light up with dazzling data streams, but something gnawed at him. He remembered flying the Gripen E during testing, how responsive it was, how alive it felt in the pilot's hands. The F-35 was a masterpiece of technology, but it felt like flying under supervision. The Gripen felt like freedom. Across the ocean, Saab released a new promotional video, showing the Gripen E slicing through storm clouds with a single line of narration. Some nations buy power, others build independence. The message was subtle, but it was aimed directly at Canada. Defense analysts noticed, so did Washington. The challenge wasn't over, it had only changed shape. Gripen E had become more than a jet. It was now an idea, a symbol that questioned how much control smaller nations really had over their own defense. And as the political applause faded, and the reality of long-term F-35 costs began to settle in, even those who had celebrated started to wonder. Had Canada made a choice out of strength or out of fear? The winds over the Arctic carried no answer, only the faint roar of distant engines. One American, one Swedish, racing each other through the cold northern sky. Months passed, but the unease refused to fade. The F-35s began to arrive, sleek, menacing, cloaked in the illusion of perfection. The media hailed them as the crown jewels of Canada's air power. Yet, deep inside the hangars where technicians worked long nights, whispers spread like wildfire. The maintenance crews noticed how fragile the stealth coating was, how often the systems demanded recalibration, and how every small repair required clearance from the United States. Canada had purchased advanced technology, but at the cost of control. Each jet was bound by software locks, unseen digital chains that connected Ottawa's skies to Washington's servers. Updates, codes, and diagnostics all had to pass through the United States first. Some pilots joked that the jets were loyal not to Canada, but to whoever held the encryption key. And in quiet frustration, engineers remembered the Gripen E, the jet that could be serviced anywhere by anyone and rearmed in minutes without foreign approval. Independence had been sacrificed in exchange for complexity, but the story didn't end there. Beneath the surface, the Gripen's challenge was taking on a new life. Swedish intelligence had begun sharing subtle reports. Several nations, watching Canada's struggles, had reopened talks with Saab. Countries like Brazil, Finland, and the Czech Republic were considering larger Gripen fleets. The very jet Canada had rejected was slowly reshaping the global defense market. Nations were realizing what Sweden had always known. True air power was not about cost or stealth, but control. Meanwhile, Canadian analysts began to notice irregularities. The F-35's operating costs were far exceeding projections. For every hour in the air, hours of maintenance followed. The stealth skin cracked in freezing temperatures, radar signatures spiked during humidity changes, and repair times tripled during Arctic conditions. Canada's extreme winters were proving harsher than the jet's American designers anticipated. In contrast, the Gripen E, built to thrive in Swedish cold, could have flown effortlessly through those same skies. But that truth had been buried beneath contracts and politics. One evening, a small group of retired officers gathered in a quiet Ottawa restaurant. Among them was a man who had been part of the evaluation committee years before. Over coffee and low conversation, he revealed what many had long suspected. "Gripen wasn't just competitive," he said softly. "It actually won several categories." The table fell silent. He continued. "They changed the scoring system mid-process. The Americans didn't want a rival jet built outside their ecosystem. It wasn't about the plane. It was about control outside. The city lights flickered across the river, and the weight of that revelation hung in the air. Canada had chosen the path of alliance, but it had also chosen dependence. And somewhere across the Atlantic, Sweden had chosen defiance, the quiet kind that doesn't roar, but resonates. Saab's engineers kept refining their fighter, making it smarter, faster, and deadlier, all while keeping it affordable and independent. In the world of military aviation, that combination was unheard of, almost dangerous. By now, Gripen E had become something larger than a fighter jet. It was a symbol of resistance against defense monopolies. It represented nations that refused to be dictated to. Nations that wanted the sky on their own terms. Defense experts began referring to it as the rebel jet. It was compact, efficient, and unshackled by the politics that bound others. Every update it received came from within Sweden, not across foreign firewalls. It was the very embodiment of the freedom Canada had once sought to protect. As global tensions grew and new threats rose in Europe and the Pacific, the importance of self-reliance became clear. Canada's F-35 fleet, still years away from full readiness, faced delay after delay. Spare parts were slow to arrive, maintenance costs doubled, and software glitches grounded jets unexpectedly. In contrast, Gripen squadrons across Sweden and Brazil were flying at record availability rates, upgrading their systems seamlessly with homegrown software. The irony was impossible to ignore. Canadian pilots, many of whom had tested both aircraft, spoke privately about their experiences. "The F-35 feels like a machine that doesn't fully trust you," one pilot said. "Gripen responds like it's alive. It becomes part of you." Their words spread through forums and defense circles, fueling a quiet movement. People began to see that Canada's decision hadn't ended the competition. It had only started a new one. A battle of philosophies, control versus cooperation, freedom versus dependence. In military briefings, officials still defended the F-35 choice, claiming it strengthened alliances and ensured technological superiority. But the tone had changed. For every justification, there was now a question. And for every answer, a new doubt. The Gripen's shadow loomed quietly over every policy meeting, every defense conference, every strategic plan. The Swedish jet that had once been dismissed had become the ghost that haunted Canada's skies. And in that silence, between pride and regret, a truth emerged. Power was not always about possession. Sometimes it was about the freedom to choose without fear. And that freedom, the one Gripen represented, had slipped from Canada's grasp. But the wind was shifting again, and the world was beginning to notice. The Challenger was not done. It was still flying, still improving, and still proving that in the war for the sky, the fiercest weapon of all was independence. Years later, the glow of the F-35 deal began to dim. The first wave of jets had entered service, but what was once hailed as Canada's proud leap into the future now felt like a burden. Operational costs spiraled far beyond projections. The government issued reassurances, promising that maintenance challenges would stabilize in time. But inside the bases, reality painted a darker picture. Pilots flew fewer hours due to limited parts. Engineers spent endless nights recalibrating systems that refused to cooperate with the harsh Canadian cold. Each flight felt more like a privilege than a routine. Rumors started to spread that the Defense Ministry had quietly requested additional US assistance to manage software issues, a move that raised alarm among those who still remembered the Gripen E's simplicity. The Swedish jet needed no foreign code approval, no waiting for transatlantic updates. In Sweden and Brazil, Gripen squadrons flew freely, performing exercises in freezing conditions and tropical storms alike. But in Canada, the jets that were supposed to symbolize independence had become dependent on another nation's servers. At defense conferences, questions began to sting sharper. Was the F-35 the right choice? One journalist asked a senior official during a televised panel. The official smiled tightly and gave the same answer rehearsed for months. It's the most advanced fighter in the world. But his eyes betrayed uncertainty. The audience knew it. Analysts knew it. Even the pilots, silent and disciplined, felt it. Somewhere along the line, Canada's choice had stopped being about capability and had become about image. Then came the leak, not from Ottawa, but from Europe. A classified Swedish report surfaced, analyzing the F-35's Arctic performance using satellite data and intercepted maintenance statistics. The findings were damning. According to the report, the F-35's operational readiness in extreme cold dropped below 50%. Gripen E, on the other hand, maintained consistent reliability above 85%. The data spread across defense networks like wildfire. It wasn't just a comparison. It was a revelation. The jet Canada had rejected could have been the one best suited for its climate, its geography, and its strategy. Public debate reignited. News anchors questioned why billions were being poured into an aircraft that required foreign oversight and constant patching. Even within the military, voices grew louder. A leaked memo from a senior Air Force official admitted that Gripen had outperformed the F-35 in key cold weather drills. The official's note was short but haunting. We ignored what worked because we feared standing alone. In Sweden, Saab responded subtly but deliberately. They released a new promotional campaign, showing Gripen E landing on a narrow highway, covered in frost, refueling from a truck, and taking off again within minutes. The tagline appeared on screen in bold letters, "Built for Independence." It was more than marketing. It was a message aimed at every country that had chosen convenience over sovereignty. And it hit its mark. Defense forums and media outlets exploded with comparisons. Some began calling Gripen the fighter that haunts Canada. The whispers turned into unease, and unease into quiet regret. Within the Canadian Air Force, pilots who had flown the Gripen during evaluation could not forget its responsiveness, its raw connection between man and machine. It was like flying instinct, one test pilot said anonymously. Gripen didn't just follow commands, it anticipated them. The F-35, in contrast, felt distant, a system governed by algorithms locked behind invisible walls. It was advanced, yes, but sterile. It flew by the book, not by the heart. As more nations looked toward Gripen, Finland, the Czech Republic, Thailand, Canada's decision began to seem less visionary and more political. Saab's engineers, meanwhile, pressed forward, unveiling a new variant, Gripen E Block 2, equipped with AI-assisted threat analysis, improved range, and hybrid networking that allowed real-time data sharing with drones. The fighter that Canada had once dismissed was now leading a quiet revolution. It wasn't just competing with the F-35, it was redefining what modern air power meant. Inside Canada's parliament, the debate resurfaced. Opposition members questioned the cost, transparency, and growing dependence on foreign infrastructure. The government defended its choice, but the words felt hollow. Every time an F-35 grounded due to software sync issues, the argument weakened. Every new Gripen deal abroad added weight to the doubt. Canada had chosen technology, but it had lost flexibility. And in warfare, flexibility was survival. Late one evening, a senior defense strategist drafted an internal note to the Prime Minister's office. The message was calm but cutting. Our skies are secure, but our autonomy is not. The Gripen question will return, and next time, we won't be able to ignore it. The note never became public, but its contents spread quietly among the defense elite. The realization was growing. Canada's skies might be defended by American jets, but its decisions were no longer entirely its own. Far to the east, in a Swedish hangar illuminated by blue light, the next Gripen prototype roared to life. The engineers watching didn't speak, but they knew what it symbolized: the persistence of independence. For every nation that had chosen the F-35, there was now a shadow in the sky, a rival that stood for something different. The Gripen E was not just an aircraft anymore. It was proof that smaller nations could still challenge giants. And as it cut through the night air with a deafening roar, a single truth echoed silently across continents. The challenge to Canada's decision wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Months turned into years, and yet the echoes of Canada's controversial F-35 decision refused to fade. Behind closed doors, officials tried to shift focus toward modernization, infrastructure, and interoperability. The safe words that masked growing tension. But inside the Royal Canadian Air Force, something had changed. The pilots who once celebrated the arrival of the F-35s now flew with a quiet, reluctant discipline. The thrill was gone. The trust was fractured. And deep inside, many couldn't shake off the question that haunted every mission briefing. What if we had chosen Gripen? The turning point came unexpectedly during a joint NATO Arctic exercise known as Northern Shield. Canada deployed a fleet of F-35s to operate alongside Swedish Gripen E and Norwegian F-16. The mission was to simulate interception and electronic warfare in sub-zero conditions over the Arctic Circle. At first, everything went according to plan, until a storm hit. Communication lines froze, GPS signals fluctuated, and half the F-35 fleet was grounded due to ice buildup and data link disruptions. Only one aircraft type remained fully operational throughout the chaos: the Gripen E. In the control center, a senior Canadian officer watched in disbelief as the Swedish jets continued flying with precision, using highway strips as temporary runways. The data feed from NATO command confirmed it. Gripen had achieved a 100% mission completion rate under conditions that grounded even the US jets. That night, as the storm cleared, the silence in the Canadian briefing tent was heavy. No one dared say it out loud, but everyone knew the results spoke for themselves. By morning, reports had already leaked to international defense media. Headlines flashed across screens. Gripen outsmarts F-35 in Arctic storm test. Canada's fighter fleet struggles in harsh conditions. The comparisons were brutal, but accurate. Sweden's smaller, cheaper, and more flexible fighter had done what the world's most expensive aircraft could not: adapt and endure. Ottawa scrambled to manage the fallout. Officials emphasized different mission parameters, unexpected weather, and data misinterpretation, but few believed them. In the global defense community, perception was reality, and perception now favored Sweden. The Gripen E wasn't just challenging the F-35 on paper anymore. It was outperforming it in the very environments Canada called home. Then came the real shock: a leaked conversation between senior Canadian defense advisors discussing a potential secondary procurement of Gripen E units as a complementary asset for Arctic operations. Though never officially confirmed, the leak triggered a wave of speculation. Analysts debated whether Canada might consider dual fleet integration, something unheard of in modern air doctrine. The message was clear. Even within Canada's highest ranks, faith in the F-35 was fading. Meanwhile, Saab seized the moment. Their new campaign aired globally: crisp, cinematic shots of Gripen jets slicing through blizzards, accompanied by a haunting tagline: "When others pause, we fly." It was more than an ad. It was a declaration, a symbolic reminder to nations that independence didn't come from alliances alone. It came from self-reliance, from technology that worked with you, not for someone else. Across Europe, Asia, and even South America, air forces began re-evaluating their priorities. The Gripen E, once dismissed as a budget fighter, was now being seen as a precision weapon of sovereignty, affordable, adaptable, and unshackled by geopolitical strings. Canada had sparked a global conversation it never intended to. And ironically, every new Gripen deal signed abroad was a quiet reflection of Canada's own misstep. In a private debrief months later, a retired Canadian air commander spoke candidly during an interview for a military journal. "The F-35 is a marvel," he said, "but Gripen is freedom. We bought the future, but we lost control." His words echoed across defense circles like a quiet confession, a truth few dared to admit publicly, yet everyone recognized deep down. Back in Sweden, the Gripen program continued to evolve, quietly pushing boundaries. Saab engineers were testing AI-driven threat avoidance, stealth coatings that adapted to radar frequencies, and even an autonomous drone companion, nicknamed Ghost Wing. Each innovation moved Gripen further ahead in the race, a race it was never meant to win, but now dominated through resilience and design simplicity. And so, as the sun set over the frozen landscapes of northern Canada, a silent truth lingered in the crisp air. The F-35s stood in their hangars, majestic, powerful, but cold and complex. Somewhere far away, a Gripen E touched down on a makeshift road, refueled, and soared back into the sky. Two symbols of air power, one bound by complexity, the other liberated by adaptability. In that contrast lay the essence of the story. Canada's choice had been made, but the shadow of that choice would follow for generations. The Gripen E had done more than challenge the F-35. It had challenged the very idea of what progress meant, proving that sometimes true advancement doesn't come from the biggest budget or the loudest boast. It comes from the quiet brilliance of a jet that refuses to bow, even to giants.